The brochure looked perfect. Golden Years European River Cruise, a journey of a lifetime. 12 elderly couples from Riverside Retirement Community had pooled their savings to book the trip of their dreams through Tiana Graves' travel agency. But when they arrived at the airport, there were no tickets, no cruise, and no Tiana. For 16 years, everyone assumed she'd stolen their money and fled the country. They were wrong. Tiana Graves had tried to save them from something much worse. This is the story of how one woman's desperate attempt to protect her clients from a sophisticated international fraud ring cost her everything, and how her sacrifice would ultimately expose a criminal network that had been preying on elderly travelers for over 2 decades. March 18, 2007, 6:30 a.m. Riverside Retirement Community's parking lot is buzzing with excitement. 12 elderly couples, some using walkers, others clutching each other's hands, are loading their suitcases into a chartered bus. They're dressed in their finest travel clothes, passports carefully tucked in money belts, cameras around their necks. These aren't wealthy people. Harold Morrison, 74, had saved for 3 years by skipping his morning coffee at the diner. Betty Morrison had sold her grandmother's jewelry to afford the trip. Frank and Dolores Chen had even taken out a small loan against their modest home. They called themselves the Riverside Rovers, and for 18 months they'd been planning the trip of a lifetime, a European river cruise with stops in Budapest, Vienna, and Amsterdam. The brochure promised Golden Years European River Cruise, a journey of a lifetime. Total cost, $28,500 per couple. For most of them, it represented their entire life savings. They trusted their travel agent, Tiana Graves, completely. She had spent hours with each couple, customizing their itinerary, explaining every detail, even helping some of them get their first passports. She promised to meet them at the airport for one final send-off, but when their bus arrived at Chicago O'Hare International Airport 3 hours later, Tiana wasn't there. And when they approached the check-in counter with their confirmation numbers, the airline agent's face went pale. "I'm sorry," she said, typing frantically into her computer. "There's no record of any bookings under these confirmation numbers. There's no record of any group reservation. There's nothing here." Within hours, the devastating truth emerged. Their $340,000, their combined life savings, their retirement dreams, their trust in humanity had vanished along with their travel agent. But here's what nobody knew that day, what nobody would know for 16 years. Tiana Graves hadn't stolen their money. She had tried to save their lives. What I'm about to tell you will completely shatter everything you think you know about this case. Because the real criminals weren't the ones who disappeared. They were the ones who had been watching, planning, and preparing to destroy these innocent people in ways far worse than financial theft. Before Tiana Graves became the most hunted woman in America, before her face appeared on wanted posters and true crime documentaries, she was someone completely different. And understanding who she really was and what she discovered is the key to understanding why she made a choice that would destroy her life but save 12 others. Tiana was never supposed to be a travel agent. At 31, she was a rising star in international business, with a degree from Northwestern University and fluency in English, Spanish, French, and Mandarin. She had job offers from Fortune 500 companies and dreams of traveling the world for work. But sometimes life forces you onto a different path. When Tiana's father, Robert, suffered a massive stroke during her senior year of college, everything changed in a heartbeat. He had been her hero, a kind man who had worked 2 jobs to put her through college after her mother died when Tiana was 16. Without hesitation, Tiana moved back to Cedar Falls, Iowa, and used her father's insurance settlement to buy a failing travel agency called Wanderlust Travel. The previous owner was retiring, and the business was hemorrhaging money, booking mostly package deals to Vegas and Florida. But Tiana had a different vision. She noticed something that larger agencies missed. There was an entire generation of retirees who didn't want to sit on beaches or play slot machines. They wanted real adventures. They had spent 40 years raising families and building careers, and now they finally had time to see the world. So Tiana specialized in what she called adventure travel for the golden years. European river cruises through medieval castles, photo safaris in Kenya, where 70-year-olds could photograph lions, cultural immersion trips to Southeast Asia, where retirees could learn traditional cooking from local families. Her clients didn't just book trips with Tiana, they fell in love with her. She would spend 3 hours with a nervous first-time traveler, explaining everything from passport requirements to local customs. She maintained personal relationships with tour operators in 37 countries, ensuring her clients received treatment usually reserved for VIPs. But Tiana's greatest strength, her obsessive attention to detail, would also become her greatest danger. Because in December 2006, while reviewing booking confirmations for the Riverside Rovers cruise, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. The communication patterns weren't right. Email headers were slightly off. Confirmation numbers didn't match standard formats. And when she started digging deeper, she uncovered something so sinister, so sophisticated, that it would put her life in immediate danger. Tiana had stumbled onto an international criminal network that had been operating for years, targeting elderly American travelers. But they weren't just stealing money. They were harvesting something far more valuable: personal information that could destroy lives for decades. What Tiana discovered would reveal that the Riverside Rovers weren't just at risk of losing their vacation money. They were about to become victims of something infinitely worse: a sophisticated international conspiracy that used fake travel bookings to identify and target wealthy American seniors for identity theft, romance scams, and financial destruction. And the people behind it had just realized that Tiana was onto them. The idea for the European river cruise started innocently enough. Harold Morrison, a 74-year-old retired bank manager, was flipping through a travel magazine when he saw an advertisement for Danube River cruises. His wife, Betty, a former school principal, had spent her entire career teaching European history and had always dreamed of seeing the castles along the Rhine. Word spread quickly through Riverside retirement community. These weren't wealthy retirees, they were middle-class couples who had saved carefully throughout their working lives. But the idea of finally taking the trip of a lifetime was intoxicating. They formed what they called the Riverside Rovers, a travel club that met monthly in the community center to plan their adventure. By fall 2006, 12 couples had committed to the journey: Budapest to Amsterdam, Christmas markets in Vienna, Neuschwanstein Castle in Bavaria, wine tastings in the Rhine Valley. The total cost was $28,500 per couple, representing years of careful saving for most participants. They chose Tiana's agency because of her reputation for handling complex international travel, and because she offered something the big companies didn't: genuine personal service. Tiana spent months crafting the perfect itinerary. She researched the best river cruise lines, negotiated group rates, and arranged special excursions tailored to the group's interests. The Riverside Rovers trusted her completely, making their deposits in cash to avoid credit card fees. But here's what nobody realized at the time, and this is crucial to understanding what happened next. Their dream cruise had attracted the attention of people who made a living turning elderly Americans' dreams into nightmares. These weren't ordinary criminals. They were part of a sophisticated international network that had been operating for years, and they had developed a method so clever, so complex, that even experienced travel agents like Tiana couldn't see it coming, until it was almost too late. What Tiana discovered in the weeks before the cruise would change everything. It would reveal a criminal conspiracy so vast and so dangerous that exposing it would put her clients' lives at risk, and it would force her to make a choice that no one should ever have to make. But first, let me tell you about the phone call that started it all. January 15th, 2007. Tiana was working late at her office when the phone rang. The voice on the other end was smooth, professional, with a slight accent she couldn't quite place. "Ms. Graves, this is Victor Petrov. I represent a European tour operator, and we're very interested in partnering with American travel agencies who specialize in senior group travel." Something about Victor's questions immediately put Tiana on edge. He wasn't asking about her services or her agency's capabilities. Instead, he wanted to know specific details about her senior citizen groups. How many people typically traveled together? What financial arrangements did they make? Did they prefer to pay in cash? When Tiana pressed for details about his company, Victor became evasive. He promised to send documentation, but never did. He mentioned a website that didn't exist. And when Tiana asked for references from other American travel agents he'd worked with, He quickly changed the subject. But Victor's call was just the beginning. But Victor's call was just the beginning. Over the following weeks, Tiana received similar calls from other European tour operators, all asking the same suspicious questions about her elderly clients. Then came the email that made Tiana's blood run cold. In February 2007, Tiana received what appeared to be a confirmation email from the cruise line handling the Riverside Rovers booking. The email looked legitimate at first glance, but Tiana's trained eye caught subtle irregularities. The logo was slightly different, the email address didn't quite match the cruise line's format, and the booking number seemed off. When Tiana called the cruise line directly, she discovered something absolutely terrifying. No booking existed for the Riverside Rovers. According to their records, Tiana had never contacted them, and they had no record of receiving any payments. Someone had created elaborate fake communications, making it appear that the cruise line was working with Tiana when, in fact, her client's money had never reached the legitimate operator. But as Tiana would soon discover, this wasn't just simple fraud. It was something far more sinister and far more dangerous. What Tiana uncovered next would reveal the true scope of the conspiracy she had stumbled into. This wasn't just about stealing vacation money from elderly Americans. It was about something much more valuable and much more personal, and the people behind it were willing to kill to protect their secret. Working frantically through the night, Tiana used her industry contacts to trace the fake communications. What she discovered was a criminal network so sophisticated, so international in scope, that it would have impressed intelligence agencies. The scheme was diabolical in its complexity. The criminals would identify travel agents who specialized in senior group travel, then insert themselves into the booking process using fake communications from legitimate travel companies. They would collect the client's money through the unwitting travel agent, then disappear. But here's what made this truly terrifying. Theft wasn't their primary goal. Money was just a bonus. They were using the fake bookings to harvest personal information from wealthy American seniors. Passport numbers, home addresses, financial details, medical information, family contacts, everything needed to destroy someone's life. And they were selling this information to other criminal networks across Europe and Asia. The Riverside Rovers weren't just at risk of losing their vacation money. Their personal information had been compromised and was being sold to criminals involved in romance scams, investment fraud, identity theft, and worse. Tiana discovered that the network had been operating for years, victimizing hundreds of elderly Americans. They had stolen millions of dollars and had destroyed countless lives through identity theft and targeted scams. But the most terrifying discovery was yet to come. As Tiana dug deeper into the network, she realized they knew she was investigating them. Her office phone began ringing at odd hours with no one on the line. Files on her computer mysteriously disappeared and reappeared. Her home security system was hacked. And then came the text message that changed everything. Stop digging, or your clients will suffer more than financial loss. The threat was clear and credible. If Tiana exposed the fraud, the criminals would retaliate against the Riverside Rovers using the personal information they had already gathered. These weren't idle threats. Tiana's research had revealed that the network had a history of targeting anyone who interfered with their operations. Tiana now faced an impossible choice. She could contact the police immediately, exposing the fraud, but potentially putting her clients in mortal danger while the investigation unfolded. Or she could find another way to protect them while gathering evidence to expose the entire network. What she decided to do next would save 12 couples from becoming victims of international criminals, but it would destroy everything she had worked for and force her to live a lie for 16 years. By March 15, 2007, Tiana was running out of time. The Riverside Rovers were scheduled to depart in 3 days, and she still hadn't figured out how to tell them their dream vacation was actually a criminal trap. She had spent weeks documenting the fraud network, collecting evidence of fake communications, and tracking wire transfers to accounts in Eastern Europe. She had identified at least 6 other travel agents who had been victimized by the same scheme, representing hundreds of elderly travelers whose information had been compromised. But the criminals' surveillance of her activities was escalating. They had made it clear that any attempt to expose them would result in retaliation against her clients. And Tiana knew these weren't empty threats. She made a decision that would haunt her for the next 16 years. Tiana would take the blame for the fraud herself. She would allow her clients to believe she had stolen their money, protecting them from the larger criminal network, while she found a way to expose the conspiracy without putting them at risk. She would disappear, taking evidence of the international fraud ring with her, and find a way to bring them to justice from the shadows. It was a decision that would save 12 couples from becoming victims of international criminals, but it would destroy her reputation, her business, and her life. On the evening of March the 15th, Tiana carefully prepared for her disappearance. She transferred the Riverside Rovers' money to a secure account, where it would be safe until she could return it. She gathered all the evidence she had collected and prepared multiple copies for law enforcement. Most importantly, she wrote detailed letters to each of the 12 couples, explaining what had really happened and apologizing for the deception she was about to perpetrate. She couldn't mail the letters immediately. That would expose her plan. But she hoped someday the truth would come out. What happened next would create a mystery that would last for 16 years. But it would also set in motion a chain of events that would eventually bring down an entire international criminal network and reveal the truth about one of the most misunderstood acts of heroism in modern history. At 6:30 p.m. on March the 15th, 2007, Tiana locked her office door for the last time. She had told the Riverside Rovers she would meet them at 7 p.m. for a final pre-departure briefing, but she knew she wouldn't be there. By 7 p.m., Tiana was already 50 miles out of town, driving toward a new life under a carefully constructed new identity. She had left behind everything that mattered to her business, her home, her friends, and her reputation. In the eyes of the world, Tiana Graves had become a thief who had stolen $340,000 from innocent retirees and fled the country. But the truth was exactly the opposite. She had sacrificed everything to protect them from something much worse. The discovery of Tiana's theft devastated the Riverside retirement community. The 12 couples didn't just lose their vacation money, they lost their trust in humanity. Several couples never recovered financially from the loss. 2 marriages ended in divorce due to the stress and recriminations. Harold Morrison, who had first suggested the cruise, blamed himself for encouraging others to participate. He spent years trying to track down Tiana, hiring private investigators and following leads across multiple states. Betty Morrison became reclusive and fearful, convinced that if they couldn't trust someone like Tiana, they couldn't trust anyone. The local police investigated with limited resources and no evidence of foul play. Detective Maria Rodriguez, who handled the case, always felt something didn't add up about Tiana's alleged theft, but she couldn't find evidence to support her suspicions. Meanwhile, the international fraud network continued operating, moving on to new victims and new travel agents. Over the next 16 years, they would steal millions of dollars from elderly travelers and compromise the personal information of thousands of American seniors. But Tiana's sacrifice hadn't been in vain. While living under her new identity, she continued investigating the fraud network, gathering evidence and waiting for the right moment to expose them without putting additional victims at risk. That moment would finally come in 2023, when a young travel blogger's innocent vacation research would accidentally uncover the truth about what had really happened 16 years earlier. And what she discovered would change everything we thought we knew about the Tiana Graves case. Emma Rodriguez was a 26-year-old travel blogger who had built a successful online following documenting budget adventures across Europe. In July 2023, she was researching river cruise options for her blog when she stumbled across something that would change her life forever. While browsing travel forums, Emma found a thread from 2007 where people were discussing a failed cruise booking that had left American seniors stranded at the airport. The details caught Emma's attention because they seemed to describe sophisticated fraud rather than a simple booking error. As a digital native with excellent research skills, Emma began investigating the story as potential blog content. What she found was far more complex than a simple theft case. Emma discovered that similar travel agent frauds had occurred across the United States around the same time, all involving elderly group travelers and all following the same suspicious pattern. But she also found something that didn't fit typical fraud patterns: evidence that several of the stolen funds had eventually been returned to victims anonymously, often years after the original theft. This discovery led Emma to retired FBI agent David Park, who had worked on international fraud cases and immediately recognized the patterns Emma described. The network was incredibly sophisticated, David explained to Emma. They would identify travel agents who worked with seniors, then insert themselves into the booking process using fake communications from legitimate travel companies. But theft wasn't their only goal. They were harvesting personal information for use in other crimes. David pulled out files from cases he had worked on, including one that made Emma's heart race, a case involving 12 couples from Cedar Falls whose travel agent had allegedly stolen their money and disappeared. Tiana Graves, David said, reading from the file. This case always bothered me. The financial evidence didn't match typical fraud patterns, and the agent had no prior criminal history or financial problems that would suggest motive for theft. When Emma asked what he thought had really happened, David's response was stunning. I think she figured out what was happening and tried to protect her clients. The criminals had already compromised her clients' personal information. If she had simply reported the fraud, her clients would have been at risk of retaliation. By disappearing and taking the blame, she protected them from becoming victims of a much larger scheme. Emma's investigation was about to take a dramatic turn because someone had been watching her research, someone who had been waiting 16 years for the right person to uncover the truth. And what they were about to reveal would provide the evidence needed to finally expose the entire conspiracy. Emma's investigation took a shocking turn when she received an email from someone identifying themselves only as a friend of truth. The email was brief but intriguing. It contained a storage unit number and access code in Phoenix, Arizona, along with a simple message. The answers you're looking for are in Box 47. Emma immediately flew to Phoenix, her heart racing with anticipation. The storage unit was in a nondescript facility on the outskirts of the city. Using the access code, Emma entered the unit and found dozens of boxes filled with documents, photographs, and computer files. Box 47 contained evidence that would finally reveal the truth about what had happened to Tiana Graves 16 years earlier. The box contained copies of all the fake communications Tiana had received, detailed financial records showing how the fraud network operated, and evidence of the international criminal organization's activities across multiple countries. There were photographs of network members, transcripts of recorded phone calls, and detailed maps showing how the conspiracy operated across 3 continents. Most importantly, Emma found the letters Tiana had written to each of the Riverside Rovers couples, explaining what had really happened and apologizing for the deception. The letters were heartbreaking in their honesty and their obvious care for the people Tiana had been forced to deceive. But Emma also found evidence that Tiana had continued investigating the fraud network after her disappearance. Working under her new identity, she had spent 16 years gathering evidence and documenting the network's crimes. The files showed they had victimized hundreds of American seniors, stealing millions of dollars and compromising thousands of personal identities. The most shocking discovery was a recent document dated just weeks before Emma found the storage unit. A detailed plan to expose the entire network and clear Tiana's name, along with instructions for returning the Riverside Rovers' money with 16 years of accumulated interest. Emma realized that a friend of truth was Tiana herself, and after 16 years of waiting, she was finally ready to tell her story. Emma immediately contacted Detective Maria Rodriguez, who had handled the original investigation and was now nearing retirement. Despite 16 years having passed, Maria remembered the case clearly and had always suspected there was more to the story. Together, Emma and Maria used the evidence from the storage unit to contact the surviving members of the Riverside Rovers. Of the 12 couples who had planned the cruise, 8 couples were still alive, though several had lost spouses during the intervening years. Harold Morrison was now 90 years old and living in assisted care. When Emma and Maria visited him with news about Tiana, his first reaction was disbelief, followed by tears of relief. I always wondered, Harold said, his voice shaking with emotion. Tiana wasn't the kind of person who would steal from us. She cared too much about making people happy. But if she didn't steal our money, where has she been all these years? The answer came in the form of a video message Emma had found in the storage unit. In the message, recorded just months before Emma's investigation began, Tiana explained everything that had happened 16 years earlier. I know you probably hate me, Tiana said in the video, speaking directly to her former clients. For 16 years, you've believed I stole your money in your dreams. I let you believe that because the truth would have put you in danger from people much worse than a small-town travel agent who made off with your vacation funds. Tiana explained how she had discovered the international fraud network, how they had threatened her clients, and how she had chosen to sacrifice her reputation and her life to protect people she barely knew, but cared about deeply. Your money is all here, Tiana continued, emotion evident in her voice, with 16 years of interest. I couldn't return it earlier without exposing you to retaliation from the criminals who had your personal information. But they've finally been arrested, and it's safe for the truth to come out. The video message was just the beginning. Emma's investigation, combined with the evidence Tiana had gathered over 16 years, was about to provide law enforcement with everything they needed to dismantle the entire international fraud network. The arrest that followed would make international headlines. The network Tiana had discovered was even larger and more dangerous than anyone had imagined, and the evidence she had gathered would reveal crimes that went far beyond simple travel fraud. Working with agencies across multiple countries, investigators used Tiana's evidence to arrest more than 40 people involved in the international fraud scheme. What they discovered was staggering in its scope and sophistication. American seniors and had sold personal information that led to additional millions in losses. Viktor Petrov, the man who had first contacted Tiana in 2007, was revealed to be the leader of the American operations. He had been living in Miami under a false identity, running the network from a legitimate-seeming import business that served as a front for money laundering operations. The arrests made international news, with Tiana's story becoming a symbol of how one person's sacrifice had ultimately brought down a vast criminal enterprise. Media outlets that had once portrayed her as a heartless thief now celebrated her as a hero who had protected innocent victims at tremendous personal cost. But for the people who mattered most to Tiana, the Riverside Rovers, the vindication was bittersweet. They had spent 16 years believing they had been betrayed by someone they trusted, only to discover that person had actually saved them from something much worse. Viktor Petrov and his associates were convicted on multiple counts of fraud, money laundering, and identity theft. Petrov himself received a sentence of 25 years in federal prison. During the trials, prosecutors revealed that the network had been planning to use the Riverside Rovers' personal information for a new type of scam targeting elderly Americans' healthcare benefits, a scheme that could have cost each victim tens of thousands of dollars and potentially their lives. The meeting took place at the Riverside Retirement Community on a sunny afternoon in September 2023. 8 couples, now in their 80s and 90s, gathered in the same community center where they had first planned their European cruise 16 years earlier. Tiana arrived looking older but recognizable, accompanied by Emma and Detective Rodriguez. She had been living in Oregon under the name Sarah Mitchell, working as a bookkeeper for a small nonprofit organization. She had never married, never had children, and had spent 16 years in exile to protect people she barely knew but cared about deeply. The reunion was emotional and complex. Some couples welcomed Tiana with tears and gratitude, finally understanding the sacrifice she had made. Others struggled to reconcile their anger from 16 years of believing she had betrayed them with the reality of her heroism. Harold Morrison, now the unofficial spokesman for the group, spoke for many when he said, "We lost more than money when you disappeared, Tiana. We lost faith in people, in trust, in the idea that good people exist in the world. Getting that back is worth more than any vacation could ever be." Tiana returned the full amount each couple had paid, plus interest calculated at 5% annually. For most couples, the returned money totaled more than $40,000, far more than their original $28,500 investment. But more importantly, she returned something they had lost 16 years earlier: their faith in human goodness. In the spring of 2024, something remarkable happened. The 4 couples from the original Riverside Rovers, who were still healthy enough to travel, decided to finally take their European river cruise, and they invited Tiana to join them. The trip wasn't the same as it would have been in 2007. They were older, some required mobility assistance, and they had lost friends and spouses along the way. But in many ways, the cruise was more meaningful than it would have been 16 years earlier. Harold and Betty Morrison, now married for 67 years, stood on the deck of their river cruise ship as it passed through the Rhine Valley. Next to them stood Tiana, no longer the young travel agent who had sacrificed everything to protect them, but a woman who had proven that some things are more important than personal success or reputation. You know, Betty said to Tiana as they watched the German countryside pass by, this cruise is even better than we imagined. We're not just seeing Europe. We're traveling with someone who showed us what real integrity looks like. The other passengers on the cruise ship couldn't have known the story behind the small group of elderly Americans and the quiet woman who accompanied them. They couldn't have known about the 16-year journey that had brought them to this moment, or the criminal network that had been dismantled to make this trip possible, but they might have noticed something special about the group, the way they looked out for each other, the obvious affection they shared, and the sense that they were celebrating something much more significant than a vacation. As their ship sailed through the heart of Europe, the Riverside Rovers weren't just fulfilling a dream that had been delayed by 16 years. They were completing a journey that had taught them profound lessons about trust, sacrifice, and the true meaning of heroism. Today, Tiana Graves works as a consultant for law enforcement agencies, helping them identify and investigate travel-related fraud schemes targeting vulnerable populations. But her work goes far beyond simple consulting. She has become one of the country's leading experts on international fraud networks, training FBI agents, local police departments, and consumer protection agencies across all 50 states. At 47 years old, Tiana has never returned to the travel industry professionally, but she has found a new purpose that gives deeper meaning to her 16-year sacrifice. Every month, she receives calls from law enforcement agencies who need her expertise to unravel complex fraud schemes. Her unique perspective, having been both a victim and an unwitting participant in international crime, gives her insights that traditional investigators simply can't match. The Riverside Retirement Community established the Tiana Graves Fund for Senior Travel Safety, which has become a national model for protecting elderly travelers. The fund provides education resources, fraud detection training, and support for victims of travel-related crimes. To date, the fund has helped identify and prevent over 200 fraud schemes, saving an estimated $15 million in potential losses. But Tiana's impact extends far beyond financial protection. She regularly speaks at senior centers, retirement communities, and ARARP events across the country, sharing her story and teaching elderly Americans how to protect themselves from predators who see their life savings as easy targets. Her presentations are both educational and deeply moving, as she explains how criminals exploit the trust and hope that makes seniors such appealing targets. The elderly aren't just vulnerable because they have money, Tiana explains to audiences. They're vulnerable because they still believe in the goodness of people. They trust because they've lived long enough to understand that trust is what makes life worth living. Criminals exploit that beautiful quality, and that's what makes these crimes so particularly evil. The story of Tiana Graves has become a case study in business ethics courses and criminal justice programs across the country. Harvard Business School, Stanford, and dozens of other universities use her case to teach students about moral courage, ethical decision-making under pressure, and the complex relationship between individual sacrifice and societal good. Professor David Chen at Georgetown University, who teaches a course on white-collar crime, calls Tiana's case the most complex ethical dilemma in modern criminal justice education. He explains to his students, Tiana Graves made a choice that violated every principle of legal compliance and traditional ethics, yet her actions ultimately saved lives and exposed a criminal network that law enforcement had been unable to identify. Her case forces us to ask fundamental questions about the nature of justice and moral courage. Criminal justice students are particularly fascinated by Tiana's decision-making process. Many struggle to understand how someone could choose to be seen as a criminal in order to protect others. The case has sparked countless debates about the relationship between legal compliance and moral responsibility. Emma Rodriguez, the travel blogger, whose investigation uncovered the truth, has written a best-selling book about the case titled The Guardian Angel of Cedar Falls. The book has been optioned for a major motion picture, with proceeds going to organizations that protect elderly Americans from fraud. Tiana's story changed my understanding of heroism, Emma writes in her book's conclusion. We're taught that heroes are people who stand up and fight, who refuse to back down in the face of injustice. But sometimes the most heroic thing you can do is disappear, to sacrifice everything you are so that others can remain safe. But perhaps the most important lesson from Tiana's story is simpler and more profound. Real heroes aren't always the people who get recognition for their actions. Sometimes the greatest acts of heroism happen in secret, performed by ordinary people who choose to do the right thing, even when no one will ever know, even when history will remember them as villains. Think about that for a moment. Tiana was willing to be hated, to be seen as the worst kind of criminal, to protect people she barely knew. She gave up her career, her reputation, her entire life, and was prepared to never receive credit for her sacrifice. That's a level of selflessness that most of us can barely comprehend. The psychological toll of her decision cannot be overstated. For 16 years, Tiana lived with the knowledge that people she cared about believed she had betrayed them. She couldn't defend herself, couldn't explain her actions, couldn't seek comfort or understanding from anyone. She had to carry the weight of being seen as a monster while knowing she had actually saved lives. The hardest part wasn't living under a false identity, Tiana revealed in a recent interview. The hardest part was knowing that Harold and Betty Morrison went to bed every night thinking I had stolen their dreams. I used to lie awake wondering if they were okay, if they had enough money for their medical bills, if they still believed good people existed in the world. That guilt was harder to bear than any punishment the legal system could have imposed. Tiana Graves spent 16 years being seen as a criminal who had betrayed the trust of innocent people. In reality, she was exactly the opposite. A woman who had sacrificed everything to protect people she cared about from dangers they never knew existed. Her story forces us to reconsider our assumptions about guilt and innocence, about heroism and villainy, about the price of protecting others. Her story proves that the truth has a way of surfacing, even after years of being buried under lies and misconceptions. And it shows that sometimes the people we think are our enemies are actually the ones who have been protecting us all along. In a world where we're quick to judge and slow to forgive, Tiana's story reminds us that we often don't know the whole story. What would you have done in Tiana's position? Would you have exposed the fraud immediately and risked your client's safety? Would you have trusted law enforcement to protect elderly victims from international criminals with unlimited resources? Or would you have made the same impossible choice she did, sacrificing your reputation and your life to protect others? This isn't just a hypothetical question. Every day, people face smaller versions of this same moral dilemma. Do you speak up when you see injustice, even if it costs you personally? Do you protect others even when they'll never know what you've done? Do you choose what's right over what's easy? This story challenges everything we think we know about heroism and justice. It shows us that sometimes the most heroic act is one that requires you to be seen as a villain. It demonstrates that real courage isn't about being fearless. It's about being terrified and doing the right thing anyway. Tiana's story also reminds us to be more careful about judging others. How many people in your life have you written off as selfish or cruel without knowing their full story? How many times have you assumed the worst about someone's motives without considering that they might be protecting something or someone you don't know about? If this story moved you the way it moved me, please hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Because in a world that often rewards selfishness and celebrates those who put themselves first, we need to remember that there are still people like Tiana Graves out there. People who choose to do the right thing even when it costs them everything. Share this story with the elderly people in your life. Help them understand that there are predators out there who will exploit their trust and kindness, but also help them understand that there are still good people in the world, people who will sacrifice everything to protect others. Don't forget to subscribe and ring that notification bell for more incredible stories that will challenge everything you think you know about justice, heroism, and the power of human sacrifice. Because these stories matter. They remind us of who we want to be and who we can choose to become. Until next time, remember, sometimes the greatest heroes are the ones history forgot until someone finally tells their story. And sometimes the people we should admire most are the ones who never expected admiration at all.